So if an argument is valid, then the conclusion is true, right? Well, not quite. Remember on the video in section 1.4, I called attention to the fact that what we mean by valid is just that the form or structure of the argument is such that it is NTP, that if the premises are true, it guarantees that the conclusion is also true. That doesn't mean that the premises are true. It just means that if they are true, that the conclusion will be true. But determining whether or not the premises are true isn't exactly the job of logic. For example, on your screen is a valid logical argument. I start with a premise with two scientific equations. One is from physics, the other one is from thermodynamics. And I say that both of these two things are true, and then in my conclusion, I garner from that one of them is true. Valid argument, right? If the premise is true, then the conclusion must be true. But is the premise true? Well, no amount of logic is going to give you the answer to that question. No, that's the job of science. That's the job of physics and thermodynamics, respectively. So we won't be able to answer that question just using logic. We'll be able to tell if the argument is valid, but not whether the premises are true. Here's another one. I used to have a dog named Oso, and I could run an argument as follows. Now, notice in that second premise, all right, the valid argument, by the way, valid argument, if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. But how are you going to know if that second premise is true? You're going to have to ask me, right? You're going to have to say, Chico, was your dog an Old English sheepdog? And there's no other way to do that. There's no magic that logic can pull, where logic alone can figure out whether I had an Old English sheepdog. And in most cases, things are going to be like this. Logic won't be able to tell you whether or not the premises are true. Logic will be able to tell you that given the truth of those premises, the conclusion follows. But it will be the job of stuff like science or other kinds of investigation to figure out whether or not those premises are true. Now you may think, well, what's the point of logic? Science is doing all the heavy lifting here. Logic is barely pulling its weight. Well, yes and no. Actually, science a lot of times works very analogically. And this is an example from the book. Consider physics. Physics gives you laws of all possible motion. But it would be unreasonable to ask of a physicist, where is everything and how is it all moving? No, if you happen to know what things are moving, the physicist can tell you where it's going to go. And in the same way, logic comes up with laws that explain how truth works. And it would be unreasonable to ask of the logician that she tell you all the different things that are true. And yet, if you can tell the logician what things are true, she can tell you what will follow from those things. What we really want is for these two things to work together. We want the logician to tell us what arguments are valid. We want science and other disciplines to tell us which premises are true. We put those two things together and we get a sound argument. A sound argument is an argument that is valid and an argument that has true premises. And if we get those two things, then we'll know that the conclusion is true. Because remember, valid means that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true based on the structure of the argument. And we just said, given the input from science and other disciplines, that the premises are true. Well, then the conclusion has to be true. Although I do want to point out, and this is something that Smith mentions in note 31, that there are some things that logic tells us are true or false. There are very few things, but they are things that are true necessarily for some logical reason or false necessarily for some logical reasons. For example, is I am either Chico or not Chico. Now think about that structure there. It says one of these two things has to be true, but those are our only two real options, right? You're either Chico or you're not Chico. So that thing has to be true. It doesn't matter. You don't have to go out and investigate the world and see, well, is everything Chico or not? We just know that's true for logical reasons. On the flip side, things that are false for logical reasons, if I were to say, I am both Chico and not Chico, well, with that proposition there, notice that the first one affirms something about reality, and then the second part of that proposition denies that very same thing about reality. It's like I've just contradicted myself, right? I've just said, I'm right. No, I'm wrong. What does that mean, right? That is necessarily a false proposition. So There are a few things like that where you can know for logical reasons whether something is true or false. But for the most part, logic is really here just to explain to us the structures that will lead to necessary truth preservation, will lead to knowing that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. And whether or not the premises are true, we'll have to actually go look for ourselves. So now we kind of have an idea of the differences between validity, truth, and soundness. Validity, the structure is such that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. Truth, whether or not the premises do correspond to reality, whether they accurately reflect reality or the conclusion as well. And soundness, we have true premises and a valid argument, therefore the conclusion has to be true. Let's practice telling the difference. For next time, please do section 1.5.1 exercises, where we'll look at some of the arguments from 1.4.1 and we'll see whether we can tell whether they are valid versus true versus sound.